Hello, my quilting friends. My name is Leah Day, and welcome to the Leaf Peepers Quilt Along. Today, we're kicking things off with some piecing tips. I want to share all of my tips and tricks for precision piecing, so that way you can get the best results making your leaf blocks. So let's get started with tip number 1, and that is to properly prepare your fabric and cut the pieces accurately for piecing. Now, I don't care how accurate your seam allowance, how perfect your patchwork foot, if your shapes, if your squares, triangles, whatever you're piecing together isn't accurately cut, you're gonna have a really hard time when it comes to sewing everything together and having those seams match just exactly right. So make sure to watch my other video. I've shared another video already on how to prepare your fabric, and I do advise pre-washing it. That's going to remove all of the excess chemicals and dyes. It's going to have all the fabric feeling the same way. You're not going to have some of it slightly stiffer from a manufacturer and some of it slightly softer. It's all going to feel the same. It's all going to act the same. It's all going to have the same amount of stretch and wiggle. And then to make it less stretchy and wiggly, we add starch. And starching and pressing your fabric is going to return that stiffness. It's going to be very stiff and stable, and that's super important. There's a lot of little pieces in these leaf blocks. There's a lot of precision piecing involved. And if you have the fabric wiggling and wobbling all over the place, you're going to have very, how can I say it, unreliable results. So I really do think for this project, starching and pressing 2 times is a really, really good idea. And then also, you'll get lots and lots of tips in that video on cutting accurately. There's a lot to cutting. I don't want to go into it in this video because this is a piecing tips video, but there are lots of little tiny steps with cutting, including the ruler that you use and including the line on the ruler that you use and all that good stuff. So make sure to watch that other video so you understand how to cut your pieces properly. So that's tip number 1, prepare your fabric and cut the pieces accurately so they're going to have the best chance of going together perfectly. Now on to tip number 2, and that is to piece with a short stitch length. So I changed the stitch length on my machine here to 1.5 millimeters. What that does is it produces a really nice tight stitch. It locks everything together, and in combination with the piecing thread I use, which is 50 weight R-Fill Mako cotton, it just locks everything together. That stitch length is super tight. It's really hard to even pick out those stitches, so they're not going anywhere. And because those stitches are so tightly put together, I feel like I can press my seam allowances open. That's tip number 3. So pressing your seam allowances open. You might have heard from other people that this is a bad thing, that this might ruin your quilt and all kinds of terribleness. Pressing your seams open is actually a wonderful thing to do because it flattens everything out. It ensures that when your needle goes through your quilt and when you're quilting that you're not hitting 5 layers of fabric at once, which is what can happen whenever you're pressing your seams to one side and you have something really bulky like a triangle. You can be hitting lots of different layers at once if you press your seams to one side. By pressing seams open, you flatten everything out. It's going to make it so much easier to machine quilt, and it's going to make your finished units so much more accurate. Promise, it's going to be the difference between your seams matching and not. And I absolutely believe that this is a-okay to do on your quilts. I have a whole quilting debate on pressing seams open. So if you'd like to learn more, definitely check out that other video. Okay, now it's time for tip number 4. So tip number 4 is to use a patchwork foot. This is a foot that has exactly 1/4 inch to either side of the center position, and to stitch through a scrap charger first before you stitch your pieces together. So here we go. I just stitched through a scrap charger, and that's just a little scrap. You know, I usually aim for about 2 inches wide by about 2 inches long, fold it in half, and you can see now my presser foot is kind of on the right height. I can just lightly lift it up and slip those fabrics that I'm piecing together right underneath the foot and get started on the right foot. And this gets you started with chain piecing so that I can piece these 2 pieces together, and then I can grab the next two pieces together and put those together and just kind of keep running in a nice line. And then whenever I get done with all of my piecing, I can stitch back through another scrap charger, and it just keeps my machine in stitching mode. This also reduces your bobbin thread waste so that you're wasting less bobbin thread with every single time that you finish off a seam. So watch this. I'm just going to grab another. This is actually just leftover binding. Usually whenever I finish off the end of a binding, you always end up with a lot left over. I just take that, leave it folded over, lift my foot a little bit, and just stitch right into it. And you can see now all I have to do is just clip off those pieced squares, and my machine is still in stitching mode. If I want to piece something else, all I have to do is just stitch to the end, maybe take one stitch off the edge of it. So let me grab something else here, and I can just piece right into this. You can see just like that. And here's another quick tip. This is a little bonus tip. Whenever you have a unit that has seam allowance like this one, always have that go into your machine first so that you have the bulkiest spot going in first. And then that way you knock it out and you kind of put it in jail, pressing it right up against your needle. And that way the pieces are going to stay together and you're not going to hit it and kind of mush it downward with your foot. You get all of that taken care of right at the beginning of the seam. And now for the last tip. I really think it's important to measure your seam allowance, particularly if you're working with a brand new patchwork foot or you haven't been piecing in a while. Open up that seam. Like I said, we can press our seams open because we piece with a very short stitch length. Press that seam allowance open and grab a ruler to place it on top. And then measure and see exactly how that is lining up. If you're going a little under or a little over, then you can move your needle over and to adjust if you need to. Some patchwork feet can be just a little bit off. And I'll be honest, on this particular patchwork foot that I'm working on, I usually bump my needle over to the left by 1 notch. And that's just something I've noticed. The seam allowance is looking just a little bit narrow, a little bit small. That would result in my blocks ending up a little bit big because I'm not taking away enough for my seams. So little tip, measure your seam so you know how accurate it is, and then also measure the finished size of your unit. If you know that that unit is supposed to be measuring 4.5 inches or 6.5 inches, measure it and double check it. If it's big, then that means that your seam allowance is too small. If the overall unit is too small, then you know your seam allowance is running a bit big. A few things that you can do to lower your seam allowance is, again, moving that needle a little bit to the left or right, if that's what you're needing to do. If you're not working with a patchwork foot, consider investing in one that fits your machine. Lower that stitch length. That can actually affect your seam allowance. Another thing that surprisingly can affect your seam allowance is your thread. How thick your thread is can actually play a role too. So I hope that you have enjoyed hearing all of these piecing tips and that you'll give some of these a try. Making accurately pieced blocks and quilts is a step-by-step process. It begins as far back as how you prepare your fabric when it comes home from the store. And it follows through with every single little detail, from how you piece through a scrap charger, to your stitch length, to pressing seams open, and then measuring to double check yourself. All of these things are great habits to build, but they might not work for everybody. This is just the things that work really, really well for me. So I hope that you'll try it out at least once. Keep what works, scrap the rest. So that's it for this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed learning all of these piecing tips with me today. Make sure to go check out Sherry's video at wholecirclestudio.com. She's going to be sharing some piecing tips as well as some organization tips on keeping all of the little units, all of the little pieces for our Leaf Peepers quilt nicely organized. So go and check that out too. If you'd like to join in the fun and make the Leaf Peepers quilt with us, all you need is a copy of the quilt pattern. You can pick it up at leahday.com/leaf. Until next time, let's go quilt. Yay! That was